I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
You're that jaywalking punk anarchist. Jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer.
And I'm Kay, and this is Skittles, Master of Ceremonies.
And we're taking a look at Feminist Theory from Margin to Center by Bell Hooks, South End Press, 1984. No, not that 1984. And not that 1984 either. Get it together, folks. The key idea of this text is, as the title suggests, looking at feminist theory from the margins to the mainstream. Who have been the authors and propagators of mainstream feminism, and who have been left out? The main argument is summarized in the introduction, where Bell Hooks states, "Much feminist theory emerges from privileged women who live at the center, whose perspectives on reality rarely include knowledge and awareness of the lives of women and men who live in the margin. As a consequence, feminist theory lacks wholeness, lacks the broad analysis that could encompass a variety of human experiences." But what do you folks think? Skittles? Kay?
Thanks, Rad. Good boy. The central assertion Hooks is making here is that the liberation of women is not a struggle that exists in isolation. Hooks uses the term white supremacist capitalist patriarchy regularly throughout the book to draw attention to the fact that patriarchy is not a hierarchy that acts alone. It is intertwined with white supremacy and the capitalist system. You cannot fight against one aspect of this social structure without fighting all of it. Hooks notes that large swaths of feminists are economically privileged white women who are only interested in the reforms necessary to be equal to economically privileged white men. Their ideas and the sites they prioritize for struggle therefore inherently neglect people on the margins of society. They neglect poor and working class women, and they neglect women of color and their unique perspective on the struggle against patriarchy. With these concerns in mind, Hooks explores the question, can women achieve meaningful liberation via reforms, or is a radical change of society necessary?
Well, with that said, let's take a look at the text in depth. Chapter 1, Black Women, Shaping Feminist Theory. Hooks starts with a critique of mainstream feminism.
Postmodern, third-wave feminism, in what appears to be a social justice crusade specifically to convince men that there's something wrong with them.
Disney continues to shove down their SJW feminazi agenda down our retinas.
That's really what feminism is. It's a giant suicide bomber that's meant to blow up tradition.
Something else I don't think anyone is talking about regarding Game of Thrones. The show appears to be going full feminist and slightly SJW.
Feminism destroys communities by destroying families.
It's a fucking women's march, Bernie! Fuck!
No, not that type of critique from those increasingly irrelevant hacks. Man, remember when YouTube used to be like that? I'm glad that that style of anti-feminism has become kind of passé at this point.
And in some ways, I am a TERF. Because feminism doesn't always include trans women.
Well, fuck. Anyway, Hooks isn't making the anti-SJW so-called skeptic critique of feminism. Instead, she makes an intersectional critique and looks at who has been the dominant leaders of the feminist movement and who has traditionally been left out. And she states, white women who dominate feminist discourse, who, for the most part, make and articulate feminist theory, have little or no understanding of white supremacy as a racial politic, of the psychological impact of class, of their political status within a racist, sexist, capitalist state. Hooks is primarily criticizing the second wave feminism of her day, but these critiques remain relevant for much of the mainstream pop feminism of today. You know, the feminism that thinks feminism is all about more female CEOs and more female drone pilots. Hooks concludes her critique stating, white feminists act as if black women did not know sexist oppression existed until they voiced feminist sentiment. They believe they are providing black women with the analysis and the program for liberation. Although this racist, paternalistic posturing still goes on today, a similar parallel exists between TERFs, trans exclusionary so-called feminists, and trans women. TERFs may think that they are protecting women from violence and sexual assault by excluding trans women, when in fact they're completely ignoring that trans women have been fighting their own fight against violence and sexual assault all along.
Chapter 2. Feminism, a movement to end sexist oppression. Hooks begins this chapter by asking a deceptively simple question. What is feminism? What does it mean? She points out that many within the United States view feminism as a movement that aims to make women the social equals of men. To which Hooks poses the question, since men are not equals in white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal class structure, which men do women want to be equal to? Hooks notes that many white bourgeois feminists are only interested in having the same access to capital as white bourgeois men, while poor and working class women, particularly those who are non-white, are acutely aware of the exploitation and marginalization of men in their social group. So for them, simply becoming exploited in the same way as those men is not liberation. Therefore, a feminism that is only about men and women being equal is not adequate. For feminism to be truly radical and to truly lead to the liberation of women, Hooks insists that it must pursue the end to domination as a political mode in its entirety. She quotes a black feminist named Celestine Ware, who expands on this idea, saying radical feminism is working for the eradication of domination and elitism in all human relationships. This would make self-determination the ultimate good and require the downfall of society as we know it today. Needless to say, many of the wealthy white women with the largest platforms in feminist discourse would not want to embrace a feminism that so dramatically challenges a status quo in which they have already benefited enormously. And the system itself reinforces this dynamic, giving more attention to those who are pursuing reforms that will not challenge the status quo in any meaningful way, leading Hooks to note, although liberal perspectives on feminism include reforms that would have radical implications for society, these are the reforms which will be resisted precisely because they would set the stage for revolutionary transformation, were they implemented. This means that the feminist reforms that do succeed are likely to only reinforce the values of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, without making genuine steps towards the liberation of women. Hooks also identifies a problem these liberal perspectives on feminism have with overly focusing on individual freedom as a central site for feminist struggle, stating, feminism is a struggle to end sexist oppression. Therefore, it is necessarily a struggle to eradicate the ideology of domination that permeates Western culture on various levels, as well as a commitment to reorganizing society so that the self-development of people can take precedence over imperialism, economic expansion, and material desires. The definition of feminism Hooks endorses would require more than simply desiring personal freedom. It requires an understanding of the complex systems of oppression that affect our lives. It requires a critical political consciousness and education. Focusing on how an individualist approach to feminism hinders women's liberation, Hooks discusses how the slogan, "The personal is political," became a means of encouraging women to think that the experience of discrimination, exploitation, or oppression automatically corresponded with an understanding of the ideological and institutional apparatus shaping one's social status. This leads women away from radical liberatory politics as they focus on their individual experiences and even project those experiences onto all women. This is how those rich white women we discussed earlier can genuinely think reforms that put them on an even footing with other rich white men constitutes liberation for women overall. This very same liberal individualist approach led many feminists to treating feminism as lifestyle politics. creating separatist communities where the struggle for liberation is taken out of the public space and into these insular groups which do little for women who are already part of marginalized communities with whom they feel kinship and solidarity. In addition, these sex-separatist communities would prove to be foundational to transphobic tendencies within feminism, but that is a story for another day.
Chapter 3: The Significance of Feminist Movement. Looking at the primacy of feminism in our lives, Hooks states, "Unlike other forms of oppression, most people witness and/or experience the practice of sexist domination in family settings. We tend to witness and/or experience racism or classism as we encounter the larger society, the world outside the home." Although most arguments in this chapter are great and set things up that will be addressed later in the text, some of this chapter unfortunately comes across like, I guess what you could call feminist reductionism, similar to class reductionism. You know, like how class reductionism acts like class oppression is all that matters, but a feminist version of that. Chapter 4: Sisterhood, Political Solidarity Between Women. Hooks starts the chapter by critiquing the sisterhood and common oppression tenets of mainstream feminism, which act like the experiences of womanhood are all the same for all women, often ignoring women's oppression of each other on race and class lines. Not only this, but the framing of common oppression as the collective experience of womanhood makes victimhood the sole collective factor that ties women together. Looking at women's oppression of each other, Hooks addresses the experience of black women in mainstream feminism. Now, I'm not black, or a woman, or even human, so I don't have any personal experiences with racism within the women's movement. However, at 1 foot 6 inches, I certainly have been talked down to. And being paternalistically talked down to by members of my community, such as fellow activists or members of the punk scene, it's particularly painful, it's infantilizing and alienating. And at least for me, activism and the punk scene, these are groups that I actively choose to be a part of, as opposed to some immutable aspect of my existence. Hooks says it in this way: "Feminist theory would have much to offer if it showed women ways in which racism and sexism are immutably connected rather than pitting one struggle against the other or blatantly dismissing racism." Hooks explains that women should find solidarity in their differences, understanding that they face oppression differently, and that they should express solidarity against oppressions that they might not individually experience, such as being a trans woman, or a black woman, or a disabled woman, or what have you. And Hooks concludes, "Women will know they have made a political commitment to eliminating racism when they help change the direction of feminist movement, when they work to unlearn racist socialization, prior to assuming positions of leadership or shaping theory or making contact with women of color so that they will not perpetuate and maintain racial oppression, or unconsciously or consciously abuse and hurt non-white women." Chapter 5: Men, Comrades in Struggle. Finally! Took her long enough, almost halfway into this book analyzing women marginalized within the mainstream feminist movement, and we can finally take a look at what this means for men and men's issues. That's my triggered MRA impression. I hope you like it.
I refuse, I repeat, refuse to spend a dime of my hard-earned money made in a gynocentric society on a female. Women are seeking to destroy me. Why do women wish to push my buttons? Do they want to see the very angry side of me? Females deserve to be holocausted.
Why is it okay for women to say, "Oh, you're 5 feet on dating sites? You should be dead"? That's okay?
Oh, but I jest. In fact, actually, I think this chapter has a lot to offer when it comes to the problems that men's rights activists see in society, and how mainstream feminism has failed to solve those problems, and how the concerns of men's rights activists would be better met by an intersectional, revolutionary, anti-capitalist feminism. Starting with how feminism engages with men, Hooks argues that middle-class mainstream feminism sees men as an enemy to be distanced from, something middle-class white women can probably economically afford to do. However, this stance alienates poor women and women of color who often see men as allies in their fights against classism and racism. Hooks states, Women can no longer allow feminism to be another arena for the continued expression of antagonism between the sexes. The time has come for women active in feminist movement to develop new strategies for including men in the struggle against sexism. Then, looking at how men could engage with feminism, Hooks argues that with feminism, men would better understand the oppression and lack of healthy relationships that comes from sexist gender roles. Discussing the abuse men engage in under patriarchy, Hooks states, "If feminist movement ignores his predicament, dismisses his hurt, or writes him off as just another male enemy, then we are passively condoning his actions." Continuing this conversation with an eye towards race, Hooks argues that what might appear to be women of color excusing sexism is actually a response to racism. Maybe this is a little confusing. Let's look at an example. One time I was having a conversation with an older black female colleague, and she said she remembers her family covering up acts of abuse or sexual assault within her black family because they knew that if that abuse were exposed to the larger white supremacist society, the racist criminal justice system would unjustly crucify those family members. So the family was stuck. What might have looked like excusing sexism by covering up abuse was actually a logical response to racist oppression by trying to insulate the family from a violent racist criminal justice system. Stories like this demonstrate why we need marginalized voices in our organizations and movements, to hear those missing perspectives, to catch our blind spots. This is why an intersectional feminism is best.
Chapter 6: Changing Perspectives on Power. When discussing power, mainstream feminist theory often understands it through the lens of patriarchy, through male domination and aggression exerted over feminine submission and deference. At the same time, the movement promotes women's rise in the ranks of the current system, securing positions for themselves to replicate that exertion of power. However, Hooks points out that these individual women, after securing positions of power in the current system, do nothing to further the liberation of all women and end sexist oppression. She notes both Margaret Thatcher and Reagan Supreme Court appointee Sandra Day O'Connor, who both spent their careers supporting policies that would materially hurt the most marginalized women and upholding white supremacist capitalist patriarchy at every opportunity. The premise that the nature of patriarchy could be meaningfully changed by simply installing women in positions of power within the current system, Hooks says, is based on the flawed assumption that women conceptualize power differently than men due to some natural characteristic, separate from material conditions. Hooks believes this is misguided, stating, like most men, most women are taught from childhood on that dominating and controlling others is the basic expression of power. In short, women also exist under white supremacist capitalist patriarchy and internalize its values every bit as much as men, even if they play a different role in it. In fact, these bourgeois feminists reproduce patriarchal conditions by accepting the premise of their role as the deferent, non-aggressive victims of male domination, the premise upon which their own unique conceptualization of power is assumed. In contrast with the patriarchal power of domination and oppression, Hooks believes the feminist movement must embrace a different kind of power, the power of solidarity. Discussing the power women leverage as consumers, she says if women all around the United States turned off their television sets for an extended period of time and purchased no products other than very basic necessities to protest exploitation of women, these actions would have significant political and economic consequences. Chapter 7: Rethinking the Nature of Work. In this chapter, Hooks addresses the mainstream feminist approach to work, which is yet another way that the class character of the feminist movement tends to manifest, further revealing its bourgeois class basis. Middle-class women shaping feminist thought assumed that the most pressing problem for women was the need to get outside the home and work, to cease being just housewives. When these women talked about work, they were equating it with high-paying careers. They were not referring to low-paying jobs or so-called menial labor. They were so blinded by their own experiences that they ignored the fact that a vast majority of women were already working outside the home, working in jobs that neither liberated them from dependence on men nor made them economically self-sufficient. Poor and working class women at this time were already working and knew all too well that work was not some magical solution that would set them free. And this focus on work as the end goal of women's liberation communicated to women outside the insular sphere of wealthy college-educated feminists that feminism had nothing to offer them, as they were already working. Indeed, many non-white workers, man and woman alike, viewed this sudden deluge of comfortable married women into the workforce as a threat. Hooks notes, black women and men were among the first groups to express fears that the influx of married white women into the job market would mean fewer hirings of qualified black people. Given the extent to which white supremacy has worked to prevent and exclude non-white people from certain jobs by grouping white women of all classes with non-white people in affirmative action programs, a system was effectively institutionalized that allowed employers to continue discriminating against non-white peoples and maintain white supremacy by hiring white women. This resulted in a devaluing of types of work that were now associated with women, as the housework of women was already devalued. Meanwhile, the newly employed housewives of the middle class were only concerned with careers they considered suitable for their station. Focus on professions and careers within feminist movement led participants to act as if all other jobs, especially those that are low-paying, have no value. In this way, feminist attitudes towards work done by the masses of women mirrored the attitudes of men. Finally, on the topic of how feminism should move forward in a world that had the majority of women entering the workforce with all its problems and new forms of exploitation, Hooks suggests, as more women face the bankruptcy of the present economic system, we must strive to envision new economic programs, while working to alleviate women's current economic plight through meaningful reforms. Efforts to create new jobs by shortening the work week should be supported. Women should support the efforts of couples to share one high-paying position. Women should work to bring an end to the family wage men receive. Women should support welfare and demand welfare reform. On a very basic level, women need to learn to manage whatever money they receive more effectively. Women need help to break their addiction to compulsive consumerism. Groups of women on specific jobs need to organize collectively to demand better working conditions. When women see that their economic concerns are a central agenda for feminist movement, they will be more inclined to examine feminist ideology.
Chapter 8. Educating Women. A Feminist Agenda. This chapter is about the divide between women's studies, college-educated, theory-focused feminism and grassroots activist feminism. To start, Hooks critiques the opaque, sesquipedalian, prolixity, ultra-crepidarian academic feminism. This is not about the tired stereotype of the triggered snowflake college feminist that the online so-called skeptics have been grifting on for almost a decade. No, this is about dense, theoretical, professional, inaccessible academic feminism. Hooks argues, many theorists do not even intend their ideas to reach a mass public, and consequently, we must take some responsibility for the superficial and perverted versions of feminist ideas that end up in the public imagination, via TV for example, or YouTube these days. Hooks concludes that we need both theory and action. Praxis, if you will. Hooks argues that college-educated feminists working with theory need to make their theory more accessible to the general public. She states, The ability to translate ideas to an audience that varies in age, sex, ethnicity, degree of literacy is a skill feminist educators need to develop. And perhaps this is happening. Speaking of YouTube, many creators such as Nueva Media, Paul Morin, Anarchopack, Noncompete, ContraPoints, Catherine, Cat Black, and many, many more are making intersectional feminist arguments more accessible to the general public. Chapter 9. Feminist Movement to End Violence. Hooks starts this exploration of violence by explaining that while male supremacy encourages the use of abusive force to maintain male domination of women, it is the Western philosophical notion of hierarchical rule and coercive authority that is the root cause of violence against women, of adult violence against children, of all violence between those who dominate and those who are dominated. Hooks argues that men must begin to challenge notions of masculinity that equate manhood with the ability to exert power over others, especially through the use of coercive force. Much of this work has to be done by men who are not violent, who have rejected the values of capitalist patriarchy. Although I appreciate Hooks's analysis, and I like her call for addressing violence with intersectionality, for example, broadening our expectations of what kinds of bodies commit violence. However, as an anarchist, specifically not a pacifist anarchist, I align more with Peter Gerdelus, who concludes that, yes, we should not assume that only men are violent or that violence is naturally inherent to men, but then depart from Hooks and say that, look at the wide history of women who have engaged in armed struggle. Let's celebrate that and recognize that violent struggle will be a component of fulfilling the goals of feminism and socialism and anti-capitalism and anarchism, and that women will be integral to succeeding in that struggle. Chapter 10. Revolutionary Parenting. Hooks starts by arguing that the middle-class mainstream feminist rejection of motherhood in exchange for careers alienated many working-class women who had long been working and who would love more time with their families. But please don't think this is some sort of agreement with the Eggman point of view.
Radical feminists then go out and say that you are chattel at home, that serving your children and helping your husband is some sort of bondage or semi-enslavement. Feminism destroys communities by destroying families.
No, Hooks is calling for more individual freedom on the part of the woman to decide for herself how she wants to live. Hooks rejects the feminist rejection of motherhood, and she rejects the traditionalist view of motherhood. Instead, Hooks argues that men and women should parent equally. She states, men will not share equally in parenting until they are taught, ideally from childhood on, that fatherhood has the same meaning and significance as motherhood. In fact, Hooks takes things even further. Her ultimate goal is a rejection of the alienating and isolating single and double parent households in exchange for a more communal version of the family. She states, ideally, small, community-based public childcare centers would be the best way to overcome this isolation. Chapter 11. Ending Female Sexual Oppression. Hooks argues that the focus on sexual liberation should also be a focus on ending sexual oppression, because the right to sex should be tied to the right to not have sex. She states, just as feminist movement to end sexual oppression should create a social climate in which lesbians and gay men are no longer oppressed, a climate in which their sexual choices are affirmed, it should also create a climate in which heterosexual practice is freed from the constraints of heterosexism and can also be affirmed. And finally, Chapter 12, Feminist Revolution, Development Through Struggle. Hooks argues that ending sexist oppression and advancing feminism means having a complete societal, economic, political transformation. It means having a concrete critique of capitalism. She states, feminist consciousness raising has not significantly pushed women in the direction of revolutionary politics. For the most part, it has not helped women understand capitalism, how it works as a system that exploits female labor, and its interconnections with sexist oppression. It has not urged women to learn about different political systems like socialism, or encouraged women to invent and envision new political systems. It has not attacked materialism and our society's addiction to overconsumption. it has not shown women how we benefit from the exploitation and oppression of women and men globally, or shown us ways to oppose imperialism. Most importantly, it has not continually confronted women with the understanding that feminist movement to end sexist oppression can be successful only when we are committed to revolution, to the establishment of a new social order. To do this, to correct all of these missteps and shortcomings of mainstream feminism, of pop feminism, new feminism needs to grow. And to do that, feminism needs to include or re-include people of all races, sexes, and genders. Then, this new feminism needs to create a new theory of action. Hooks concludes, to build a mass-based feminist movement, we need to have a liberatory ideology that can be shared with everyone. That revolutionary ideology can be created only if the experiences of people on the margin who suffer sexist oppression and other forms of group oppression are understood, addressed, and incorporated. They must participate in feminist movement as makers of theory and as leaders of action. Conclusion.
A stunning thing you might start to realize as you read this book is not only the efficiency with which class society absorbs and defangs movements for liberation such as feminism, but how many parallels there are between the recuperation of feminism and the recuperation of other liberatory struggles, from race to sexuality. Hooks puts forth a compelling argument for a truly intersectional feminism that has lessons applicable to all of these struggles. By organizing around the economic realities that unite us, we can forge a path towards changing the systemic structures that divide and harm us. If there's one thing to take away from feminist theory from margin to center, it's to keep an image in your mind of the wealthy, well-educated white women who have consistently put their priorities first and thrown marginalized women under the bus for what they and they alone have decided is feminism. Because you might see stark reflections of those people in powerful positions that you'll be expected to cheer on because we've come so far that now even a woman can guard a concentration camp. Even a woman can carry out war crimes. Maybe there's more to liberation than a more diverse boot.
Yeah, great point, Kay. Thank you. Even though this book was written in the early 80s, it has a lot to offer for a critique of feminism in our modern age, from trans exclusionary so-called feminism to the pussy hat middle-class pop feminism, and even to red pill and Gamergate and men's rights activism. Bell Hooks looks at the way mainstream feminism has often neglected the needs of poor women and women of color, and how feminism has often pushed away men and family dynamics in exchange for careerism and neoliberal individuality in a way that turns many men and women away from feminism. Bell Hooks' desire for a feminism that learns from the struggles of the marginalized, that promotes advocacy over lifestyleism, that creates solidarity with a plurality of experiences, that addresses the exploitation of all genders by capitalism, that fights to end violence between and within genders, that revolutionizes home life and parenting, that celebrates sexual liberation for all orientations, builds a mass-based movement for change, advances a liberatory ideology that can be shared with everyone, a feminism informed by and led by marginalized people. This is the feminism that we need today. If you're interested in such a feminism, then I recommend Feminist Theory from Margin to Center by Bell Hooks. Huh. I'm surprised Straw Dog never showed up. You know, play an anti-feminist skeptic type character. He's usually down for that sort of thing. He must be busy doing something else. Anyway, thank you so much, Kay and Skittles, for helping me take on this text. And if you folks would like to see more of Kay and Skittles, their channel is linked in the description below. And as always, I'd like to thank my wonderful patrons. You folks make this all possible. You pay for my dog insurance, which keeps me happy and healthy. You help me buy books for future reviews. And you're just wonderful help in general. And if you'd like to support me on Patreon and get your name added to this list of wonderful supporters? Then you can go to patreon.com/radicalreviewer. And if you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, then you can get your radical reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.